The reason I took the contract was money. That's not a dramatic confession. It's just the truth. 3 years before all this happened, my younger brother Ethan died in a freight crossing accident outside Terre Haute. Wrong place, wrong time, a chain of mistakes that nobody could completely explain. The settlement money went to our parents. The debt stayed with me. By the time I got the call from Midwestern Rail Assessment Services, I was behind on rent, driving a truck with a transmission that sounded like loose bolts in a coffee can, and taking whatever investigation work I could find. Most of my jobs involved paperwork, signal failures, liability reviews, equipment audits, the kind of work nobody imagines when they hear the word investigator. The assignment looked simple. An abandoned freight corridor running through portions of Illinois and Indiana had generated a cluster of unusual emergency reports over 18 months. The reports were causing insurance complications. My job was to determine why. I expected software issues, bad records, human error. I expected something boring. The first thing that bothered me wasn't the reports. It was how similar they were. Different dates, different operators, different weather conditions. Same passenger, not the same name. The same description. Male, approximately 40 years old. Dark coat, single suitcase. Seen seated alone. Observed after final passenger verification. Disappeared before arrival. At first glance, it sounded ridiculous. The problem was that these reports came from systems that weren't supposed to have passengers at all. The corridor had been freight only for nearly 20 years. No ticket records. No scheduled passenger service. No stations operating along most of the route. Yet dispatch notes kept mentioning an unidentified traveler. I spent my first week reviewing digital archives from a rented office above a farm equipment supplier. The building smelled like dust and old carpet glue. Every morning, I bought the same coffee from a gas station across the road. Every evening, I went back to a motel that charged by the week. Nothing about my life felt unusual until I started noticing something strange inside the reports. The descriptions were evolving. Early reports were brief. Male passenger observed. Unknown origin. Verify security footage. Later reports became more specific. Passenger acknowledged verbal greeting. Passenger requested destination confirmation. Passenger appeared familiar to crew. The last line appeared 6 separate times. Passenger appeared familiar to crew. Nobody explained familiar. Nobody elaborated. And that bothered me more than the disappearances. People remember unusual strangers. They don't usually describe them as familiar. Not unless something is influencing how they think. The first witness I interviewed was a retired engineer named Martin Hale. He lived alone outside Decatur. 2 dogs, a cluttered garage, photographs of locomotives covering half the walls. When I asked about the passenger, he became quiet, not frightened, embarrassed, like someone discussing a dream they knew sounded stupid. He told me he'd seen the man twice. Same appearance both times. Same suitcase, same seat, and every time he looked away, he forgot why the man seemed important. You ever recognize somebody you know? Martin asked, but can't remember from where? I nodded. That's what it felt like. He stared at his coffee, only stronger. That answer stayed with me all the way back to the motel, because it matched other interviews. Different wording, same idea. Recognition without memory. Familiarity without identity. A week later, I visited a maintenance depot near an inactive section of track. That's where I found the first physical evidence. Not of the passenger, of the reports themselves. An emergency communication terminal had recorded dozens of unsent messages, all addressed to dispatch, none submitted. Every message consisted of variations of the same sentence. Please confirm passenger continuation. No employee admitted writing them. The terminal showed no user activity, no keyboard input, no login records, just messages, waiting, as if something expected approval. That was the moment I stopped believing this was a software problem. And that was also the moment the reports started mentioning me. I drove back to the depot the next morning before sunrise, partly because I couldn't stop thinking about the messages, partly because I didn't want to spend another morning sitting in that rented office pretending this was a normal records review. The depot sat beside 3 inactive sidings and a maintenance yard that looked older than half the town surrounding it. The sky was gray. Cold drizzle drifted across the gravel. The place felt abandoned except for a single crew replacing signal housings near the western switch. I spent most of the morning examining terminal logs. Nothing made sense. The unsent messages existed. The timestamps existed. But every event associated with creating those messages was missing. No user authentication. No maintenance override. No network anomaly. It was as if the system had generated requests without anybody touching it. Around 11, I noticed something else. One of the requests had been answered. Not officially. Not through dispatch. Someone had typed a reply. Continuation denied. The response was dated 9 months earlier. I hadn't seen it before because it was buried inside archived maintenance records rather than communication logs. The reply came from an employee named Gregory Phelps. I searched personnel files. Retired. 71. Still living 2 counties away. I called him that afternoon. He hung up immediately. I called again. Same result. The 3rd time he answered. I introduced myself. Told him I was reviewing historical incident reports. The line stayed silent for several seconds. Then he asked one question. Did it start using your name yet? I remember sitting in the motel parking lot holding the phone against my ear. Rain tapping against the windshield. Wind rocking the truck slightly. I didn't answer immediately because I hadn't told him anything. I hadn't mentioned the personalized reports. I hadn't mentioned that 2 dispatch summaries from the previous week had included references to me. One report described communication received from investigator Reed Morgan. That was me. The problem was I had never sent any communication. The report listed statements I never made. Recommendations I never gave. Gregory sighed. The sound carried a kind of exhaustion I still remember. Not fear, not panic, just somebody tired of being right. You need to stop reading the new reports, he said. Why? Because it notices. I almost laughed. Not because it sounded funny, because it sounded absurd. And because a part of me desperately wanted this to remain absurd. Gregory wasn't interested in convincing me. He simply told me an address. Then he ended the call. His house sat outside of town, so small it barely qualified as a town. 2 roads, 1 diner, 1 church, a grain elevator. Gregory lived alone in a faded white house overlooking a soybean field. He looked older than his personnel photo, thinner, like he'd spent years sleeping badly. He let me inside without greeting me. The first thing I noticed was that every clock in the house showed a different time. Kitchen clock, microwave, wall clock, wristwatch on the table. Nothing matched. I asked about it. He ignored the question. Instead, he led me into a back room filled with binders. Hundreds of them. Maintenance records, dispatch logs, photocopies, handwritten notes. 30 years worth of documentation. At first I thought he was some kind of obsessive collector. Then I started reading. The reports stretched back decades. Different rail companies, different routes, different states. Always the same pattern. Unscheduled passenger, familiar appearance, no verified identity, disappearance before destination, and eventually, requests. Requests asking for continuation. Requests asking for transfer. Requests asking for acknowledgement. Gregory watched me flip through pages. Nobody notices until the requests start. What is it? He shook his head. Wrong question. What question should I ask? His answer came immediately. Why does it need permission? That stayed with me, because I couldn't stop thinking about it afterward. Why ask? If something possessed the ability to appear wherever it wanted, why bother with reports? Why bother with paperwork? Why involve people at all? The next few days became increasingly difficult to explain. New reports continued arriving. More frequently now. Several included direct references to me. One listed me as an onboard witness. Another identified me as having approved a route inspection that never occurred. Then came the first document that genuinely frightened me. Not because it was impossible, because it was personal. The report referenced Ethan, my brother. The passenger had apparently been observed speaking with a deceased relative of investigator Morgan during transit review. I stared at that sentence for nearly a minute, reading it repeatedly, trying to find some rational explanation, some data source, some accidental connection. There wasn't one. Ethan had never worked for the rail companies involved. His name didn't appear anywhere inside the project files. Yet there it was, typed neatly inside an official incident report. I drove 3 hours that night without really deciding where I was going. I ended up parked beside the crossing where Ethan died. I hadn't visited in almost a year. The crossing lights had been replaced. The asphalt looked newer. Everything felt smaller than I remembered. Grief does that. It expands places in your memory. I sat there until after midnight, listening to distant freight traffic, thinking about the report, thinking about how something could know his name. And for the first time, I considered quitting, walking away, sending my conclusions to the client. Software corruption, administrative inconsistency. Case closed. The problem was curiosity. I've never been particularly brave, but curiosity has gotten me into trouble more than courage ever has. The next morning, I started tracing the earliest reports. That investigation led me to a closed rail museum outside Indianapolis. The museum occupied a former passenger station. Most exhibits had been relocated years earlier. Only storage remained. The curator agreed to let me access archived dispatch materials. I spent 6 hours digging through boxes. Near closing time, I found a report from 1978. The oldest verified incident yet. The language was different, older, more formal, but the content matched perfectly. Unknown traveler, recognized by staff. No ticket, no recorded boarding location. Request for continuation. What stopped me cold was the attached photograph. The image showed a platform, several employees, 3 passengers, and there, standing near the edge of the frame, dark coat, suitcase, male, approximately 40 years old. The photograph was almost 50 years old. The man hadn't aged a day. I scanned the image, then another, different decades. Same face, same suitcase, same expression, never changing, always present, never acknowledged officially, until somebody filed a report. I took copies back to the motel. That night my room phone rang. I hadn't given the number to anyone. The caller said nothing. I listened to static for nearly 20 seconds before hanging up. The phone rang again immediately. This time I heard breathing. Slow, steady, then a voice. A man's voice. Calm, polite. Am I approved for continuation? The line disconnected. I didn't sleep. Not really. I spent the night with every light on, watching the door, checking the lock repeatedly, trying to convince myself the call was a prank, trying to convince myself somebody had somehow accessed investigation records, trying to convince myself there was still a normal explanation. By morning, I knew I was lying to myself, because a printed dispatch report had appeared beneath my motel room door, and the report hadn't existed the night before. The paper was warm, freshly printed. The document listed a single passenger, destination pending, continuation awaiting authorization, witness assigned. My name appeared beneath that line, and for the first time, I began to suspect the investigation wasn't about discovering what the passenger was. It was about deciding something the system needed for me, something nobody had managed to refuse forever. That I wish I could say I left then, that I packed my things, called the client, and got as far away from that corridor as possible. Instead, I kept going, partly because I was frightened, partly because I thought understanding the situation might make it less frightening. That turned out to be a mistake. Fear is manageable when you don't know what's causing it. Once you start seeing the shape of it, it becomes harder to ignore. The dispatch report from beneath my motel door changed everything. Not because it was impossible. At that point, I'd already crossed the line into impossible. What bothered me was the formatting. The report looked exactly like the others. Correct templates, correct routing codes, correct incident numbering. It had been generated by the same system, which meant one of two things. Either somebody inside the network was deliberately creating these documents, or the network itself was somehow participating. Neither possibility felt acceptable. I brought the report to Gregory. He stared at it for a long time. Long enough that I began wondering if he would answer at all. Finally, he sat down at his kitchen table. You're farther in than I was. What does that mean? It wants something from you specifically. What? Gregory laughed once. Not because anything was funny, because he'd asked himself the same question for years. It always wants something. Then what did it want from you? His eyes moved toward the binders lining the walls. I approved one. The room suddenly felt smaller. What? I approved one continuation request. I thought back to the messages, the responses, the strange wording. You're saying somebody actually answered? I thought it was an internal test. He rubbed his face. I was 32. New supervisor. Overnight dispatch. Strange requests came through during a storm. I thought somebody was screwing around. What happened? Gregory looked toward the window, toward the soybean field, toward nothing. The reports stopped. For a moment, that sounded encouraging. Then I noticed his expression. That's bad. They stopped on my route. I didn't understand immediately. Then I did. They moved. Gregory nodded. Different division, different states, different companies. Same passenger. A cold sensation settled into my stomach. Because if he was right, then the requests weren't documenting movement. They were enabling it. The reports weren't observations. They were permissions. The thing wasn't traveling through rail systems. It was traveling through acknowledgement, through bureaucracy, through records, through official recognition. Every approved report made it more real. The idea sounded insane, but explained something I'd been avoiding. Why every witness described familiarity. Why employees recognize the passenger without knowing him. Recognition creates legitimacy. Legitimacy creates records. Records create presence. A person exists inside a system because enough people agree they exist. What if something learned how to exploit that? The next week became increasingly difficult to separate from memory. There are sections I still struggle to place in order. I know what happened. I just don't always know when. I began finding references to the passenger everywhere. Not only rail documents, hotel logs, maintenance schedules, inspection reports, vehicle reservations, cargo manifests, places where people are expected to be documented, expected to be counted, expected to exist. Sometimes the name changed. Sometimes the details changed, but the pattern remained. A traveler moving through systems, being acknowledged, being recorded, being allowed forward. The strangest discovery came from an insurance archive in St. Louis. Buried inside a transportation liability claim from 1989, an investigator had written a handwritten note in the margin. Just 6 words. He is only there if counted. That sentence haunted me because it explained why witnesses struggled to remember him, why photographs showed him clearly, why reports mattered. He wasn't forcing himself into reality. People were helping. Every acknowledgement strengthened something. Every record became another place it could exist. And I was helping too, even without approving anything. I was investigating, interviewing, documenting, expanding the trail, making more records, creating more evidence. The realization hit me one night while reviewing photographs. There were hundreds by then, decades worth. I had arranged them across my motel room floor. Different years, different locations, different rail operators. The passenger appeared in almost all of them, not prominently, usually near the edge, partially obscured, easy to overlook, until I noticed something impossible. In newer photographs, he appeared closer, not physically closer to the camera, closer to the photographer, closer to whoever eventually reviewed the image. The progression stretched across decades. At first, he stood in crowds, then near crews, then beside conductors, then beside investigators, then beside the people filing reports, always moving toward the person documenting him, toward the observer, toward acknowledgement, toward authority, toward approval. I stopped sleeping after that. Not entirely, just in fragments. 20 minutes here, an hour there. The motel manager started asking if I was okay. I lied. Everyone lies when they don't know how to explain something. Then came the email, the one that finally convinced me the passenger wasn't merely appearing in records. He was reading them. The email arrived from my company account, sent by me, timestamped 2 days in the future. The message contained a single attachment, a transportation authorization form, already signed, already approved. My signature appeared at the bottom. The continuation request had been granted. I nearly threw my laptop across the room. Instead, I spent 3 hours verifying the file. The signature was perfect, not copied, not forged. Every authentication marker matched. According to the system, I would sign the document 48 hours later. I called the company. Their IT department found nothing. No breach, no spoofing, no anomaly. The future-dated email shouldn't have existed, but it did. And once I'd seen it, I couldn't stop thinking about what it implied. Something wasn't trying to convince me. It already expected success. That was worse, much worse. The following day, I received another call. Unknown number. Same voice I'd heard in the motel. Calm, polite, male. Your review is progressing. I said nothing. The voice continued. You understand the process now. Who are you? Silence. Then, I'm trying to arrive. The words sounded simple, reasonable even, which somehow made them more disturbing. Not anger, not threats, not demands, just intention, like somebody discussing travel plans. I don't know what you are. You do. No. Another pause. Then, your brother recognized me. The line disconnected. I sat motionless for several minutes. Not because I believed him, because I couldn't entirely dismiss the possibility. Grief is dangerous that way. It creates openings, places where impossible ideas can root themselves. I wanted to reject the statement completely. Yet a part of me kept wondering why Ethan's name appeared so often, why the reports referenced him, why the passenger kept directing the investigation toward that loss. The answer came from Gregory, or at least part of it. When I told him about the call, he looked genuinely alarmed for the first time. Not worried, alarmed. Has it started offering explanations? I guess. That's bad. Why? Because explanations create agreement. I stared at him. He continued. The moment you settle on what it is, you've acknowledged it. That sounded ridiculous. Yet the longer I thought about it, the more it matched everything else. The passenger never forced conclusions, never demanded belief, never proved anything completely. He only encouraged recognition, identification, acceptance. The same process as every continuation request. The same process as every report. And suddenly I understood why the system needed investigators. Not witnesses, not victims, authorities. People whose job was to verify reality. People whose signatures mattered. The requests weren't random. They were applications. And I was being processed as the next reviewer. 3 nights later, I finally saw him. Not in a photograph. Not in a report. Not in a camera feed. In person. At least I think it was in person. I was driving along an inactive section of corridor near the Indiana border. Rain again. Always rain during the moments I remember most clearly. The crossing lights ahead activated unexpectedly. Red signals flashing. Gate arms descending. No train scheduled. No traffic nearby. I stopped and waited. 1 minute. 2 minutes. 5. The gates remained down. The tracks remained empty. Then somebody stepped onto the crossing. A man carrying a suitcase. Dark coat. Walking slowly along the rails. Not toward me. Not away. Just moving through the intersection. The same face from the photographs. The same expression. The same age. The same impossible familiarity. And before he disappeared into the darkness beyond the crossing, he looked directly at me. Not threateningly. Not aggressively. Like someone checking whether paperwork had been completed. And for one terrible moment, I recognized him.